Long before history learned how to write itself down, there are whispers of a world that should not have existed. A time when coastlines stretched far beyond where they lie today, when humans were not supposed to build, plan, or remember anything lasting, and yet something vast may have stood at the edge of the known world. An island power, described as rich, ordered, and technologically capable, erased not over centuries, but in a single day and night. Why would an ancient philosopher place such a precise catastrophe so deep in the past? Why would he anchor it to real names, real places, and a timeline that aligns uncomfortably well with known climatic upheavals? Why do stories from Egypt, Mesopotamia, India, and beyond all echo the same memory of water rising too fast for cities to escape? Why does modern geology confirm that the end of the last ice age was not gentle, but violent, abrupt, and globally disruptive? And why do we continue to assume that human societies of that era were too simple to be worth losing? If entire coastlines vanished when the ice melted, what else disappeared with them? If early people lived by the sea, as humans always have, where would their settlements be now? And if knowledge survived catastrophe by fragmenting into myth, ritual, and stone, how would we recognize it today? Before we dive deeper, ignite that like button and prepare for the revelations to come. Tell me in the comments where you are listening from, what time it is there. And as always with our videos, the visuals are here to add context, but they aren't necessary to follow along. Thank you for always having our back. Prepare yourself, and let's dive in. Around 12,000 years ago, the world entered a moment of instability that modern science is only beginning to understand in full. The long retreat of the Ice Age did not unfold as a smooth, gradual warming. Instead, after millennia of slow change, the climate lurched violently in the opposite direction. Temperatures dropped suddenly, winds intensified, and entire regions that had been stabilizing were thrown back into harsh, unpredictable conditions. This interval, now known through ice cores and sediment layers, marked a rupture in the natural rhythm of the planet. For human communities living at the margins of ice and sea, it was not an abstract shift in data, but a lived catastrophe, experienced through failing ecosystems and disappearing land. During this period, vast amounts of water were still locked inside continental ice sheets. Sea levels sat far lower than they do today, exposing enormous coastal plains that no longer exist. These plains were not empty wastelands. They were fertile zones where rivers braided across wide shelves, where animals migrated, and where humans settled because food, water, and access to trade routes naturally converged. Archaeological patterns show that people consistently favored these environments whenever they were available. They built camps, then villages, and over generations developed deep familiarity with the land. When those lands vanished, they did not merely lose territory, they lost memory, infrastructure, and continuity. The sudden return to cold conditions disrupted this fragile balance. Glaciers advanced again, rainfall patterns shifted, and regions that had supported growing populations became unreliable. In some areas, drought replaced abundance. In others, storms intensified, eroding coastlines and riverbanks. Human groups adapted as they always had, but adaptation has limits when change accelerates faster than cultural knowledge can respond. The archaeological record reflects this stress. Sites are abandoned abruptly. Tool traditions break off. Population density thins in places that had previously supported sustained habitation. Then came the reversal. As abruptly as the cold had returned, it ended. The planet warmed again, but this time the consequences were even more dramatic. Ice that had accumulated for tens of thousands of years began to melt at extraordinary speed. Meltwater surged into the oceans, raising sea levels not by centimeters per century, but by meters within human lifetimes. Low-lying coastal zones were swallowed, not slowly reclaimed by tides, but overtaken in destructive pulses. Entire landscapes disappeared beneath advancing water, carrying with them whatever traces of human presence they held. Geological evidence captures this moment with unsettling clarity. Layers of marine sediment appear suddenly over what had once been dry land. Coral reefs show signs of rapid drowning. Ancient shorelines now lie far offshore, mapped only through sonar and satellite imaging. These findings are not speculative. They are measurable, repeatable, and consistent across continents. What remains uncertain is how much human history was embedded in those lost regions. Stone tools and campsites found near former coastlines hint at extensive habitation. But the deepest evidence now rests beneath hundreds of feet of water. For people who lived through this transformation, the experience would have felt apocalyptic. Familiar landmarks vanished. Freshwater sources turned brackish. Burial grounds, hunting routes, and seasonal camps were erased. Survival demanded movement inland into territories already occupied by other groups. Conflict, assimilation, and cultural compression followed. In such conditions, knowledge rarely survives intact. It fractures, carried by survivors as stories, symbols, and ritualized memories rather than precise records. This is the context in which later legends begin to feel less abstract. Accounts preserved thousands of years later speak of great floods, of lands that sank, of civilizations undone not by war but by nature itself. These stories emerge independently in regions separated by oceans, yet they share a striking emotional core. Water rises, order collapses, a previous world ends. Modern readers often dismiss these narratives as metaphor or moral allegory, but their persistence suggests something more durable than fiction. Myths endure when they encode experiences too significant to forget, even after their original details fade. The challenge lies in reconciling these memories with material evidence. Writing did not exist during the final stages of the Ice Age, so no direct testimony survives. What remains are indirect signals, unusual architectural leaps shortly after the floods, sudden concentrations of symbolic behavior, and sites that appear fully formed rather than gradually developed. These anomalies do not prove the existence of lost civilizations, but they complicate the idea that human societies emerged from simplicity in a straight, uninterrupted line. When monumental structures appear earlier than expected, built by communities that supposedly lacked the agricultural surplus to support them, the question is not whether history is wrong, but whether it is incomplete. Cultural knowledge can be inherited as easily as land. Skills in organizing labor, orienting structures, and encoding cosmology into stone may survive collapse, passed down in fragmented form until conditions allow them to surface again. The disappearance of coastal worlds offers a plausible mechanism for such inheritance. If advanced social systems developed in regions now submerged, their material remains would be largely inaccessible. Survivors moving inland would carry practices rather than buildings, concepts rather than cities. Over generations, these fragments could seed new traditions that appear sudden and inexplicable when viewed without their submerged context. This perspective does not require speculation about fantastical technology or impossible achievements. It rests instead on a sober recognition of geological violence and human vulnerability. The end of the Ice Age was not a gentle dawn of civilization, but a convulsive threshold that erased more than it preserved. What we call the beginning of history may simply be the point at which the surviving threads became visible again, stripped of the worlds that once wove them together. In this light, the past becomes less of a straight road and more of a broken landscape, shaped by forces larger than any single culture. Beneath the calm surface of modern seas lie territories where human lives unfolded, adapted, and ended. Their absence from the record is not evidence of non-existence, but a reminder that history favors what remains above water, leaving what sank to silence. When the story of a vanished island enters written history, it does not appear as folklore or poetry, but as part of a philosophical record. In the 4th century before the Common Era, an Athenian thinker preserved an account that he attributed to much older sources, tracing its transmission across generations and cultures. According to this record, the story was not invented for entertainment or moral theater alone, but carried as a memory from a time far removed from classical Greece. Its details were anchored to geography, genealogy, and chronology in a way that was unusual even for ancient storytelling. The island was said to have existed beyond the narrow sea that connected the Mediterranean to the wider ocean. This boundary, known in antiquity as the Pillars of Hercules, marked the edge of the familiar world. Beyond it lay a vast landmass, positioned not as a distant fantasy, but as a reachable place with harbors, plains, and mountains. The description emphasized scale. This was not a small settlement or scattered tribe, but an organized power with influence stretching across surrounding regions. Its wealth came from fertile soil, abundant water, and access to resources that allowed sustained growth. At the center of this society stood a capital city designed with deliberate symmetry. Rings of land and water alternated outward from a central precinct, creating both beauty and defense. These canals were not decorative. They functioned as transportation corridors, linking neighborhoods, fields, and ports. Materials used in construction were described with specificity. Stone of different colors formed walls and foundations, reinforced with metals that were valued not only for appearance, but for durability. Among these materials was orichalcum, spoken of as rare and precious, suggesting either a now-lost alloy or a symbolic reference to refined metallurgy. The political structure of this civilization reflected order rather than chaos. Power was divided among rulers bound by laws meant to preserve balance and restraint. For generations, this system maintained harmony, allowing the society to flourish without descending into internal collapse. Agriculture supported dense populations. Engineering enabled large-scale construction. Maritime skill produced fleets capable of traveling far beyond local waters. In every respect, the society was portrayed as capable, stable, and prosperous. Its decline did not begin with natural disaster. It began with moral erosion. As prosperity accumulated, ambition grew unchecked. Expansion replaced balance. Military campaigns extended influence through force rather than alliance. This shift marked a turning point, not because conquest was unknown in the ancient world, but because it represented a departure from the principles that had sustained the society. When an attempted invasion met resistance, the consequences followed swiftly. The destruction itself was described with stark brevity. Earthquakes and floods struck with overwhelming force. In a single day and night, the island was rendered uninhabitable, its land fractured and submerged. What had once been solid ground became impassable sea. Navigation through the area was said to be impossible afterward, clogged by mud and debris. The precision of this description has drawn attention for centuries, not because it proves the event occurred, but because it mirrors the effects of known geological catastrophes. The timeline attached to this event places it deep in the past. The destruction was said to have occurred 9,000 years before the lifetime of an Athenian lawgiver whose journey to Egypt preserved the story. When translated into modern reckoning, this places the catastrophe near the end of the last ice age. This coincidence has been repeatedly noted because it aligns with a period of intense environmental change when ice sheets collapsed and oceans rose rapidly. The account's survival through Egyptian sources adds another layer of complexity. Egypt maintained long traditions of record-keeping, carving historical memory into stone and preserving priestly archives across dynasties. According to the story, priests in a Nile Delta city recounted the island's fate as part of a much older historical framework, one that extended far beyond Greek chronology. They spoke of cycles of destruction, of civilizations erased by fire or water, and of humanity repeatedly forced to begin again with diminished knowledge. Such ideas were not unique to a single culture. Flood narratives appear across the ancient world, from Mesopotamian epics to South Asian cosmology. These stories differ in characters and symbolism, yet converge on a shared theme of overwhelming water erasing an earlier age. When cultures separated by thousands of kilometers preserve similar memories, the question becomes less about literal interpretation and more about origin. Shared experience leaves traces even when language and belief diverge. Modern skepticism often frames the island story as allegory, a cautionary tale about hubris and decline. This interpretation holds value, yet it does not fully account for the level of geographic and architectural detail embedded in the narrative. Allegories rarely require concentric canals, mineral inventories, or precise spatial relationships. These elements suggest that the story may have drawn upon inherited descriptions rather than pure invention. At the same time, the absence of direct archaeological evidence demands restraint. No definitive ruins have been identified that match the description in full. The ocean conceals much, but concealment alone does not confirm existence. What the account offers instead is a lens through which to view a turbulent period in human history, one marked by instability, loss, and transformation on a planetary scale. Seen this way, the island becomes less a singular place and more a symbol anchored to real conditions. It represents the possibility that organized societies emerged earlier than commonly acknowledged, thrived in vulnerable environments, and vanished when those environments collapsed. Whether the island existed exactly as described matters less than what its story preserves. It captures a memory of sudden endings, of worlds undone not by gradual decay, but by forces beyond control. The enduring power of this account lies in its refusal to fade. For over 2,000 years, it has resurfaced in debate, art, and exploration, not because it offers easy answers, but because it intersects uncomfortably with what geology now confirms. At the threshold between ice and warmth, stability and chaos, humanity faced events capable of erasing entire chapters of its own story. The island stands at that threshold, marking the edge of what was lost and what survived. As the ice sheets collapsed and coastlines withdrew inland, the physical record of early human life fractured, along with the land itself. What survived above water became the foundation for archaeology, while what sank slipped beyond reach. This imbalance shaped how the past would later be reconstructed. Evidence clustered inland gave the impression that civilization emerged suddenly and locally, when in reality it may have retreated from drowned margins into narrower corridors of survival. The map of early history was redrawn by the sea, favoring what remained dry over what had once sustained entire populations. Across the world, remnants of this transition appear as abrupt discontinuities. Long-established settlement patterns break off without gradual decline. In some regions, stone tool styles vanish and reappear elsewhere with altered forms, suggesting migration under pressure rather than slow cultural evolution. These shifts do not follow the neat progression expected from stable environments. They reflect disruption, compression, and the urgent need to adapt to shrinking habitable space. When land disappears faster than memory can be preserved, continuity gives way to reinvention. Coastal zones had always attracted dense populations. Rivers met the sea there, creating rich ecosystems that supported fishing, hunting, and early plant management. Travel by water linked communities far more efficiently than overland routes through forests or mountains. When these zones were inundated, the loss was not only geographic but social. Networks collapsed, trade dissolved, shared practices fractured into isolated traditions carried inland by survivors. The archaeological silence beneath the oceans reinforces this distortion. Modern surveys reveal submerged river valleys, ancient shorelines, and terraces that once stood above water. These features are not speculative. They are mapped through sonar, satellite data, and drilling cores, yet the tools required to excavate them are limited, costly, and rare. As a result, vast areas where early societies likely flourished remain unexplored. What is absent from textbooks is not necessarily absent from history, but from access. Against this backdrop, certain post-Ice Age sites appear unexpectedly advanced. Monumental architecture emerges without a long visible prelude of experimentation. Large-scale organization becomes evident before agriculture is firmly established in surrounding regions. These anomalies challenge linear models of development. Rather than representing sudden invention, they may reflect the reassembly of older knowledge under new constraints. Skills refined over generations do not vanish instantly. They migrate with people and adapt to new landscapes. One of the most striking examples lies in southeastern Anatolia, where massive stone enclosures were erected at a time when communities were still transitioning from mobile lifeways. The labor required to quarry, transport, and carve enormous pillars implies coordination far beyond small kin groups. Symbolic carvings suggest shared cosmology and ritual practice. Yet there is little evidence of permanent domestic life at the site. This inversion, ritual preceding settlement rather than the reverse, unsettles conventional expectations. Such sites indicate that social complexity does not depend solely on agriculture. Organization, belief, and memory can precede farming, shaping it rather than emerging from it. In a world recovering from environmental collapse, gathering people for ritual may have been as essential as producing food. Shared ceremonies could stabilize identity, transmit knowledge, and reinforce cooperation when resources were uncertain. Stone, unlike wood or fiber, preserved these efforts long after the societies themselves transformed. The deliberate burial of some early monumental sites adds another layer of meaning. Covering massive structures with earth required sustained effort and intention. This was not accidental abandonment. It suggests closure, preservation, or protection of spaces that had fulfilled their purpose. In a post-catastrophe world, sealing a sacred center may have marked the end of an era remembered as dangerous or complete. Burial ensured survival through concealment, allowing rediscovery millennia later. Elsewhere, underground architecture hints at a different response to instability. Subterranean cities carved into soft rock offered refuge from extremes above ground. Their design prioritized ventilation, water access, and defense, enabling long-term habitation below the surface. Narrow passages limited intrusion, while massive stone doors sealed entrances from within. Such features imply anticipation of threat, whether from conflict, climate, or both. Living underground was not a casual choice, but a strategic adaptation. The scale of these underground networks points to planning over generations. Excavation on this level required foresight, shared purpose, and technical understanding of geology and airflow. These were not improvised shelters. They were engineered environments capable of supporting thousands. In regions shaped by volcanic rock, such construction was feasible, but feasibility alone does not explain motivation. A stable world does not drive populations beneath the earth. Across these diverse responses, a pattern emerges. Early societies confronted a landscape that no longer behaved as expected. Sea levels rose, weather shifted, familiar routes vanished. In response, humans reorganized around what could endure. Stone replaced wood. Depth replaced exposure. Ritual replaced permanence. These strategies preserved cohesion when geography could not. Myth, too, functioned as preservation. Stories condensed experience into symbols that could survive migration and loss. Floods, sinking lands, and destroyed cities became narrative vessels carrying memory forward. Stripped of precise detail, they retained emotional truth. When later civilizations recorded these stories, they encountered fragments of a deeper past, refracted through generations of retelling. The challenge for modern understanding lies in separating metaphor from memory without dismissing either. Geological evidence confirms that the end of the Ice Age was marked by abrupt, destructive change. Archaeology reveals discontinuities consistent with forced adaptation. Together, they form a context in which legends of lost worlds gain coherence. They need not be read as literal maps, but as encoded recollections of survival. What emerges is a vision of early history shaped by erasure as much as creation. Civilizations did not simply rise from simplicity, some retreated from complexity under pressure. The traces that remain favor what endured by chance, not what mattered most at the time. Beneath the seas and beneath the earth lie the outlines of human responses to catastrophe, preserved unevenly and revealed only when conditions allow. In this fragmented record, certainty remains elusive. Yet the convergence of geology, architecture, and myth suggests continuity across disruption. Humanity did not begin anew after the Ice Age. It carried forward what it could. The monuments, shelters, and stories that surface in the archaeological record are not isolated wonders, but survivors of a deeper, largely invisible landscape of human experience. As coastlines retreated and inland corridors narrowed, evidence of human adaptation began to surface in unexpected places beneath the sea. Marine archaeology has revealed submerged structures whose forms resist easy classification as purely natural. Stone alignments, terraces, walls, and foundations appear along continental shelves that were once dry land. These discoveries do not stand as proof of a single lost civilization, but they establish a crucial fact. Humans lived extensively along coasts that are now underwater, and some of their constructions endured long enough to be preserved by the sea itself. One of the most discussed underwater features lies off the coast of the Bahamas, where large, flat stone blocks form a linear arrangement along the seafloor. The stones sit at consistent angles and appear stacked rather than scattered. Their surfaces show fracturing patterns that resemble deliberate shaping. For some observers, the formation evokes the remnants of a constructed pathway or breakwater. For others, it represents a natural phenomenon known as beach rock, limestone hardened by coastal processes and later broken into rectangular slabs by erosion. Geological analysis supports the latter explanation, showing that such formations can arise without human intervention. Yet the debate itself underscores a larger point. The boundary between natural and human-altered landscapes becomes harder to define when viewed through the lens of deep time and rising seas. Further east, off the coast of India, underwater surveys have documented the remains of an ancient city described in long-preserved texts. Stone walls, pillars, and foundations lie submerged near a modern shoreline, their arrangement consistent with urban planning rather than random deposition. Radiocarbon dating of associated materials suggests great antiquity, pushing the site's origins back toward the early Holocene. What was once dismissed as myth gained material weight when physical structures aligned with literary descriptions. This convergence between text and archaeology does not resolve every uncertainty, but it demonstrates that memories of submerged cities can persist accurately across millennia. These findings point toward a broader pattern. Early human settlements clustered near water not only for sustenance, but for movement and exchange. Rivers and coasts functioned as highways in a world without roads. When sea levels rose, these networks vanished. Structures built of stone or packed earth had the best chance of survival, especially when quickly buried by sediment. Wooden dwellings, organic tools, and woven materials decayed rapidly, leaving behind an incomplete picture dominated by the most durable remnants. The ocean preserves selectively. In some cases, it erodes relentlessly. In others, it seals sites beneath layers of silt, creating time capsules untouched for thousands of years. Advances in sonar mapping and remotely operated vehicles have expanded access to these hidden landscapes. Ancient shorelines can now be traced far from modern coasts. Sunken river systems reveal where fresh water once flowed. In these drowned valleys, the likelihood of past human activity is high. Each mapped feature expands the potential archive of early history beyond traditional excavation sites. In the Western Pacific, A massive stepped structure rises from the seafloor near a small island. Its sharp edges, flat plains, and terraced form resemble monumental architecture. Some researchers interpret the formation as the result of natural fracturing along geological fault lines, shaped further by wave action and seismic activity. Others point to apparent stairways, platforms, and carved features that suggest intentional modification. The structure's age, if shaped above sea level, would place its origin near the end of the last ice age, when global waters were far lower. What gives this site significance is not consensus, but implication. If natural forces alone produced such geometry, they did so in a way that mirrors human design. If human hands played a role, even partially, the structure would stand as evidence of complex construction before the widespread rise of agriculture. Either interpretation challenges assumptions about early landscapes. Nature and culture may not have occupied separate domains, but interacted more fluidly, with humans shaping stone in ways that later erosion could both obscure and exaggerate. The reluctance to accept early coastal construction often stems from gaps in preservation rather than absence of activity. Archaeology has long depended on terrestrial excavation, favoring caves, deserts, and floodplains, where organic decay slows. Coastal zones, by contrast, are dynamic and destructive. Waves, tides, and currents erase evidence efficiently. Rising seas compounded this erasure by removing sites entirely from reach. As a result, the archaeological record skews inland, reinforcing the illusion that early complexity emerged away from coasts rather than being displaced from them. Textual traditions fill some of these gaps. Across cultures, stories describe cities claimed by the sea, not as isolated events, but as part of cyclical destruction. These narratives often include details that mirror known geological processes, such as sudden inundation, ground instability, and uninhabitable waters. While myth reshapes experience through symbolism, it rarely invents environmental mechanisms wholesale. Flood stories persist because floods occurred repeatedly and traumatically at scales that exceeded ordinary memory. The challenge lies in aligning narrative fragments with physical traces. Underwater archaeology advances slowly, constrained by cost and technology. Each discovery requires careful contextualization to avoid misinterpretation. Skepticism remains necessary, but dismissal carries its own risk. When evidence lies beyond traditional reach, absence of proof reflects methodological limitation rather than historical certainty. What emerges from submerged sites is not confirmation of legendary empires, but a revised understanding of early human geography. Coastlines once hosted vibrant societies whose material footprints were largely erased by rising water. Survivors carried cultural knowledge inland, where it reappeared under new conditions. Later observers, encountering fragments without their original context, perceived sudden innovation rather than continuity disrupted by loss. In this light, underwater ruins function as reminders of imbalance in the historical record. They reveal how much of early human experience occurred in places now inaccessible. Each mapped structure or sunken shoreline extends the timeline of settlement outward, not forward. It pushes civilization's roots into landscapes no longer visible, where adaptation unfolded in response to forces larger than any community. The sea does not simply conceal, it transforms history by filtering what endures. Stone survives where wood vanishes. geometry persists where daily life dissolves. The result is a record that favors monuments over meals, foundations over families. Recognizing this distortion allows a more cautious reading of the past. Early societies were not absent from submerged lands. They were present, active, and vulnerable. Their disappearance from view reflects environmental change, not historical insignificance. In the Nile Valley, the emergence of one of humanity's most enduring civilizations unfolded against a landscape already shaped by deep time. Long before dynasties carved their names into stone, the river had deposited layers of memory along its banks, renewing the land while preserving traces of earlier habitation. Egypt did not arise in isolation. Its earliest phases show signs of inherited structure, as if cultural foundations had been laid before written history began to speak clearly. This impression becomes stronger when examining traditions that describe a remote age preceding the first pharaohs. Ancient Egyptian records speak of a time when the land was ruled not by mortal kings, but by beings remembered as semi-divine. These figures were said to have governed for extraordinarily long spans, maintaining order before dynastic rule took shape. Later scribes treated this era as historical rather than mythical, embedding it within king lists that stretched backward beyond conventional chronology. While modern scholarship interprets these reigns symbolically, their inclusion reflects an awareness of deep antiquity and an acknowledgement that Egypt's origins extended far beyond its earliest monuments. The physical landscape reinforces this sense of continuity. Beneath the temples and pyramids that dominate the plateau at Giza lies bedrock marked by erosion patterns inconsistent with the arid climate that has prevailed for thousands of years. The contours carved into exposed stone resemble the effects of prolonged rainfall rather than wind-blown sand. Geological studies have noted that such weathering would require sustained precipitation, a condition last present near the end of the Ice Age. If portions of the Giza complex were shaped during a wetter epoch, their origins would precede dynastic Egypt by millennia. This possibility unsettles traditional timelines, not because it demands radical revision, but because it introduces layering. Structures visible today may sit atop earlier phases of construction, modification, or symbolic significance. Later builders often repurposed ancient sites, drawn to locations already imbued with meaning. Sacred geography endures even as cultures change. A place remembered as powerful does not lose that status simply because its original purpose fades. Astronomical alignment further complicates the picture. The major pyramids of Giza are positioned with extraordinary precision, oriented almost perfectly to the cardinal directions. This accuracy exceeds what would be expected from simple observation alone. Some researchers have noted that the spatial relationship between the pyramids mirrors a specific stellar pattern visible in the night sky during a distant epoch. Whether this correspondence was intentional or coincidental remains debated, but the possibility suggests a sophisticated understanding of celestial cycles deeply integrated into architectural planning. Astronomy in ancient cultures was not abstract science. It was a way of anchoring human order within cosmic rhythm. Aligning monuments with stars symbolized continuity between earth and sky, mortality and eternity. If such alignments reference a sky configuration from deep antiquity, they may encode inherited knowledge rather than contemporary observation. In that case, builders were not inventing cosmology anew, but expressing traditions carried forward through time. Precision construction itself implies accumulated expertise. The transport and placement of massive stone blocks required planning, coordination, and engineering skill. Quarrying techniques, leveling methods, and joint fitting reveal mastery developed through experience. While experimentation certainly occurred, the scale and consistency of Egypt's earliest monumental works suggest that foundational knowledge was already mature. Skills of this magnitude do not emerge spontaneously. They are refined across generations, often through projects now lost to erosion or inundation. Written records from later periods hint at reverence for an earlier age of wisdom. Temples were described as restorations rather than creations, honoring patterns established by predecessors. Knowledge was framed as recovery rather than discovery. In such a worldview, decline followed an initial perfection, and progress meant preservation of what had been inherited. This perspective aligns with broader ancient beliefs that humanity moved away from a golden age rather than toward it. When placed within the context of post-Ice Age disruption, these traditions gain coherence. Communities forced to migrate inland after coastal loss may have converged in fertile river valleys like the Nile. There, they adapted inherited practices to new environments. Over time, memory of their origins compressed into symbolic narratives. Semi-divine rulers became ancestors of extraordinary longevity. Floods became cosmological resets. Architecture became a bridge between lost worlds and present stability. This does not require imagining advanced machines or forgotten empires in the modern sense. It requires recognizing that social organization, symbolic systems, and technical skills can reach high levels without leaving extensive written traces. Stone preserves intention where text does not. Geometry outlasts language. When writing finally emerged, it captured only the surface of traditions already ancient. The Nile's predictable cycles offered refuge after chaos. Annual floods replenished the soil, providing a rhythm absent from more volatile landscapes. In this stability, fragmented knowledge could consolidate. Ritual formalized memory. Monumental building fixed cosmology in place. Over centuries, these processes produced the civilization recognizable today. Yet beneath its polished surface lies a palimpsest, layered with echoes of earlier responses to environmental upheaval. Understanding Egypt as a receiver rather than sole originator of knowledge reframes its achievements without diminishing them. Adaptation is itself a form of genius. Transforming inherited fragments into enduring order required vision and discipline. The question is not whether Egypt was capable, but whether its capabilities were nurtured by deeper roots extending into a world altered beyond recognition. Seen through this lens, the Nile Valley becomes a crossroads of survival. It absorbed displaced traditions, stabilized them, and projected them forward. Its monuments stand not only as triumphs of a single culture, but as repositories of human continuity across catastrophe. What they encode may be less about sudden invention and more about remembrance shaped into stone, enduring long after the waters receded and the older landscapes vanished from view. In the mountains of the eastern Mediterranean, a different kind of inheritance lies embedded beneath later civilizations. Long before Roman columns rose into the sky, massive stone foundations were set into the earth with a precision and scale that continue to resist simple explanation. These foundations form the base of a site, that would later become one of the grand religious centers of the ancient world. What draws attention is not what stands above ground, but what lies beneath it, blocks so large that even later builders chose not to move them. The platform consists of stone blocks weighing hundreds, and in some cases more than 1,000 tons each. They are cut with flat faces and fitted together so tightly that blades cannot be slipped between them. No mortar binds them. Their mass alone provides stability. The stones were quarried nearby, but distance is only part of the puzzle. Moving such weight requires not only force, but planning, control, and an understanding of leverage that borders on the limits of pre-modern engineering. Later cultures recognized the significance of this foundation. Rather than dismantling it, they built directly on top of it, accepting the platform as a given. This decision speaks volumes. Even societies renowned for their construction skill assessed the underlying stones and judged them beyond replication. The foundation became an inherited certainty, an immovable legacy from a time whose methods were no longer accessible. Local traditions preserved alternative explanations. Some attributed the stones to giants, others to legendary kings, others to a world before the Great Flood remembered across cultures. These stories are often dismissed as attempts to fill gaps in understanding, yet they serve another function. They mark recognition of discontinuity. The builders of later eras knew they were not the originators of what lay beneath their feet. Nearby quarries deepen the mystery. Enormous blocks lie partially detached from the bedrock, abandoned before transport. One such stone outweighs even those used in the platform itself. Its presence suggests that the project was halted or abandoned mid-process. The reasons remain unknown. Environmental change, social disruption, or loss of technical capacity could all explain why stones prepared for movement never reached their destination. The question of method often dominates discussion, but intention matters just as much. Such massive construction implies purpose beyond convenience. Foundations of this scale are not necessary for ordinary structures. They signal permanence, resistance to time, and symbolic weight. Building on this level reflects a worldview that valued endurance across generations, perhaps shaped by prior experience of impermanence. When placed alongside other early monumental sites, a pattern emerges. Stone was chosen not merely because it was available, but because it survived where other materials failed. After a world reshaped by rising water and unstable climate, permanence became a priority. The effort invested in immovable foundations can be read as a response to loss, an assertion that something would remain even if landscapes shifted again. This perspective reframes the question of capability. Instead of asking how ancient builders achieved the impossible, it asks why they felt compelled to try. Communities that had witnessed or inherited memory of environmental collapse may have oriented their architecture toward stability above all else. Massive stone anchors the human presence against forces that once erased entire territories. Underground cities offer a parallel response. In regions shaped by volcanic rock, entire populations carved living spaces beneath the surface. These subterranean environments provided insulation from temperature extremes, concealment from threat, and access to reliable water sources. Ventilation shafts maintained breathable air across multiple levels. Storage chambers preserved food for extended periods. Everything about these spaces speaks to long-term planning, Such cities were not temporary refuges. Their complexity indicates sustained habitation and repeated expansion. Levels were added, passages extended, and infrastructure refined over time. Narrow corridors limited access, while stone doors could be sealed from within. The design prioritized survival under siege, whether from human enemies or environmental instability. Attributing these constructions to later historical periods explains some features, but not all. While reuse and expansion certainly occurred, the initial excavation of vast underground networks required coordination on a scale comparable to surface monument building. The labor investment alone suggests a compelling motivation. A population does not move underground en masse without cause. Together, these responses reveal a spectrum of adaptation. Where stone was abundant and surface building viable, foundations grew massive. Where terrain allowed, cities moved below ground. In both cases, architecture became defensive, oriented toward endurance rather than display. These strategies point toward a shared memory of vulnerability, a recognition that the world above could no longer be trusted to remain stable. Written records from later periods rarely address these origins directly. Knowledge passed through practice rather than text. Builders learned by doing, inheriting techniques without preserving explanations. When conditions changed and practices fell out of use, understanding vanished even as structures remained. Later generations encountered the results without the reasoning, leading to speculation and myth. This pattern recurs throughout early history. Monumental remains outlast the social frameworks that produced them. Their silence invites projection, yet their existence imposes limits on dismissal. Something capable, organized, and intentional operated before recorded explanation. Whether these builders represented a continuous tradition or a series of responses to recurring disruption remains open. What is clear is that early human history was not defined solely by gradual progress. It was shaped by interruption, loss, and recalibration. Architecture reflects this reality more honestly than text. Stone does not narrate events, but it records priorities. When communities choose to invest extraordinary effort into foundations and refuges, they reveal what they fear and what they hope to preserve. The massive platforms and underground cities scattered across regions do not stand as isolated anomalies. They form a quiet network of responses to a world that had proven capable of erasing itself. Through them, early societies asserted continuity against uncertainty, leaving behind structures that still challenge assumptions about timing, capability, and memory. Their endurance is not accidental. It is the physical trace of a lesson learned under pressure, carved into the earth so it would not be forgotten. Across Asia, the idea of a hidden world persisted long after coastlines stabilized and climates calmed. In the high plateaus and deep valleys of the Himalayas, tradition spoke not of sunken cities, but of a realm concealed from ordinary perception. This realm was described as orderly, enlightened, and protected, existing alongside the known world rather than beneath the sea. Its geography was often rendered symbolically, with concentric layouts, radiant centers, and guarded entrances. While later interpretations framed it as purely spiritual, its structure mirrored patterns seen in earlier accounts of lost and preserved societies. Texts associated with this tradition portrayed a kingdom governed by wise rulers whose task was not expansion, but preservation. Knowledge, rather than territory, defined its power. The land was said to flourish in harmony, free from the decay that plagued the outer world. This imagery did not emerge in a vacuum. It echoed a recurring human response to collapse, the belief that somewhere continuity had been maintained even when the surrounding world fractured. The symbolic architecture of this hidden kingdom carried familiar elements. Circular design reflected balance. Central palaces signified order radiating outward. Gardens and waterways suggested abundance managed through restraint rather than exploitation. These motifs paralleled physical layouts found in earlier monumental sites where geometry encoded cosmology. Even when expressed metaphorically, the consistency of these forms hints at shared conceptual roots. In this tradition, the kingdom remained inaccessible, not because of distance alone, but because entry required transformation. Travelers were said to fail unless they possessed clarity, discipline, and alignment with the kingdom's values. Interpreted literally, such stories discouraged reckless exploration. Interpreted historically, they suggest that access to preserved knowledge depended on social qualification rather than geography. In a world recovering from catastrophe, knowledge may have been deliberately guarded to prevent misuse or loss. The narrative of concealment stands in contrast to accounts of sudden destruction. Instead of sinking beneath waves, this realm withdrew from visibility. Its disappearance was not violent but intentional. This distinction matters. It introduces the possibility that some communities responded to upheaval not by scattering or rebuilding openly, but by isolating themselves. Geography, particularly mountainous terrain, would have aided such isolation, creating natural barriers against intrusion. Elsewhere, a more literal version of concealment appeared underground. Legends of vast subterranean networks described interconnected cities stretching across continents. These accounts blurred the line between metaphor and architecture. As underground complexes were discovered and mapped, elements once dismissed as fantasy gained physical reference points. Tunnels, chambers, and sealed doors demonstrated that large populations had indeed lived below the surface, at least for extended periods. The persistence of these ideas into the modern era had unexpected consequences. In the 20th century, they attracted the attention of groups seeking origins beyond conventional history. Expeditions were launched into remote regions under the guise of scientific research, driven by a belief that ancient knowledge had been preserved in isolation. These efforts often conflated myth, nationalism, and speculation, distorting both history and intent. Yet even these misuses reflect the enduring pull of the idea that something vital had been carried forward unseen. What draws disparate traditions together is not their literal accuracy, but their shared structure. Each imagines continuity preserved through withdrawal. Each places value on knowledge over conquest. Each situates preservation in environments difficult to access, whether beneath mountains, within stone, or underwater. These patterns align with adaptive strategies observed after environmental disruption. When stability cannot be guaranteed, withdrawal becomes a form of defense. Cultural memory does not operate as a factual archive. It compresses experience into forms that can be transmitted across generations. Physical catastrophe becomes moral testing. Loss becomes concealment. Survival becomes enlightenment. Over time, these transformations obscure origin, but preserve intent. The original experiences may have involved migration, isolation, and selective transmission of skills. Their narrative descendants speak of hidden kingdoms and guarded wisdom. Archaeology provides fragments that resonate with these themes. Isolated highland sites show signs of deliberate planning disconnected from surrounding settlements. Underground complexes reveal extended occupation beyond what simple refuge would require. Ritual spaces appear separated from daily life, suggesting intentional compartmentalization of knowledge and practice. These material traces do not confirm legends, but they validate the behaviors that legends encode. The concept of preservation through concealment also explains the uneven distribution of early knowledge. Some techniques appear suddenly and fully formed, then disappear. Others persist locally without spreading widely. Knowledge held within restricted communities does not diffuse evenly. When those communities dissolve or integrate, fragments surface without context. Later cultures encounter these fragments as mysteries rather than inheritances. This framework reframes debates about lost civilizations. Instead of searching for a single vanished empire, it emphasizes repeated strategies across cultures facing instability. Withdrawal, whether physical or symbolic, protected continuity at the cost of visibility. What survived did so by becoming difficult to reach, difficult to interpret, or difficult to accept within later worldviews. In time, as conditions stabilized and populations expanded, the need for concealment diminished. Knowledge once guarded became mythologized. Spaces once functional became sacred. Stories replaced instructions. The original reasons faded, but the structures endured as echoes of adaptation. When later observers encountered these echoes, they interpreted them through contemporary lenses, often mistaking strategy for fantasy. The hidden kingdoms of tradition, whether beneath mountains or behind ritual thresholds, represent an alternative response to catastrophe. They stand alongside flooded plains and buried cities as part of a broader human repertoire. Faced with forces capable of erasing entire worlds, some societies chose not to rebuild immediately in the open, but to step aside, preserving coherence until the environment allowed reintegration. Seen together, these responses reveal a deep continuity in human behavior. Survival did not always mean expansion or dominance. Sometimes it meant restraint, isolation, and patience. The legacy of such choices is subtle, woven into stories that resist literal reading yet align with material patterns. In these narratives of hidden worlds lies a memory of endurance through concealment. A reminder that history includes not only what was lost to water or stone, but what was deliberately kept out of sight until the world was ready to receive it again. By the early 20th century, fragments of ancient memory had begun to collide with modern ideology. What had once circulated as myth and marginal scholarship attracted the attention of political movements seeking legitimacy through imagined antiquity. In this environment, legends of hidden knowledge and primordial origins were stripped of nuance and repurposed as tools of power. The search for deep history became entangled with ambition, turning curiosity into obsession. One of the most striking examples emerged in Europe during the interwar period. A research organization was established under state authority, tasked with investigating humanity's remote past. Its stated aim was scientific inquiry, but its underlying motive was ideological confirmation. Anthropology, archaeology, and folklore were filtered through a predetermined narrative that placed imagined ancestors at the center of civilization's origin. Evidence was selected to reinforce belief, while contradictions were ignored or suppressed. Expeditions were launched to remote regions believed to preserve traces of an ancient source culture. The Tibetan Plateau, isolated by altitude and geography, became a focal point. Researchers documented rituals, measured physical features, and collected artifacts, interpreting everything through a distorted lens. Local traditions describing hidden realms of wisdom were misconstrued as literal repositories of racial memory. Spiritual symbolism was mistaken for biological inheritance. These efforts did not uncover lost civilizations, but they revealed something else. They demonstrated how persistent the idea of preserved antiquity had become, powerful enough to motivate state-funded exploration into some of the harshest environments on Earth. Even when misused, the impulse reflected a broader unease with conventional historical timelines. Beneath propaganda lay a recognition that the accepted story of human origins felt incomplete. After the collapse of these regimes, the association between alternative history and extremism cast a long shadow. Serious inquiry into early complexity became suspect by proximity. Scholars distanced themselves from any hypothesis that suggested deep antiquity beyond established frameworks. Caution hardened into rigidity. Legitimate anomalies were often dismissed to avoid association with discredited ideologies. Yet evidence continued to accumulate quietly. Archaeological discoveries pushed human presence further back in time. Sites once thought impossible forced revisions of migration models. Footprints preserved in ancient sediment demonstrated occupation during periods previously considered uninhabitable. Each finding chipped away at certainty, not by overturning history wholesale, but by extending it beyond comfortable boundaries. Technological advances accelerated this process. Remote sensing tools transformed exploration, allowing researchers to peer beneath dense vegetation and shifting sands. Laser-based mapping revealed geometric patterns hidden beneath forests, once believed untouched by human hands. Road networks, platforms, and planned landscapes emerged from beneath the canopy, exposing organized societies previously erased from view. These discoveries carried an important implication. Complexity was not limited to regions with visible stone monuments. It flourished wherever conditions allowed, even in environments hostile to preservation. When those conditions changed, societies vanished from sight, leaving little trace until technology caught up. Absence in the record reflected environmental concealment rather than developmental simplicity. Satellite imagery expanded this reach further. Subtle anomalies beneath deserts and ice hinted at structures buried by time rather than destroyed by it. Patterns discernible only from above suggested planning on scales difficult to perceive at ground level. Each image invited careful verification, reinforcing the need for restraint alongside curiosity. Not every shape implied construction, but enough did to warrant systematic investigation. The discovery of ancient human footprints in North America exemplified this shift. Preserved in hardened sediment, they dated to a time when massive ice sheets dominated the continent. Their existence required a reevaluation of migration timelines and survival strategies. Humans were present earlier, adapting to environments long considered prohibitive. The simplicity attributed to these populations no longer aligned with evidence of endurance and movement. Such findings reframed earlier debates about lost worlds. Instead of asking whether advanced civilizations existed in the distant past, attention shifted toward understanding how adaptability, organization, and knowledge functioned under unstable conditions. Advancement was no longer defined solely by metallurgy or writing, but by the capacity to coordinate, remember, and rebuild. This reframing dissolved the false divide between mainstream archaeology and alternative speculation. The question ceased to be whether legends were true in literal form and became how collective memory encoded experience. Flood myths aligned with sea level rise, hidden kingdoms aligned with isolation strategies, monumental anomalies aligned with inherited skills adapted to new landscapes. Resistance remained, rooted in the discipline's necessary skepticism. Extraordinary claims still demanded extraordinary evidence. Yet the definition of evidence broadened. Patterns across geology, anthropology, and archaeology gained legitimacy when considered together. No single site carried the burden of proof. Instead, convergence across fields created momentum. This convergence suggested that early human history was shaped less by linear progress than by cycles of disruption and recovery. Knowledge accumulated, fragmented, and reassembled. Some techniques persisted in pockets, others vanished entirely. The record reflected survival bias, preserving what endured physically rather than what mattered socially. In this context, the failures of ideologically driven exploration offered a lesson. When the past is approached with predetermined conclusions, it becomes distorted. When it is approached with disciplined openness, it becomes richer. The same legends misused for domination could be re-examined as cultural artifacts shaped by real events. Modern inquiry moved forward cautiously, aware of past excesses. Multidisciplinary collaboration replaced solitary theorizing. Claims were tested against environmental data and material constraints. Progress was incremental, but cumulative. Each discovery refined understanding without requiring dramatic rupture. The result was not confirmation of hidden empires ruling the ancient world, but a more complex appreciation of humanity's resilience. Early societies were capable, adaptive, and inventive within the limits imposed by their environment. They did not need modern technology to organize labor, encode knowledge, or shape landscapes. They needed continuity, memory, and opportunity. The 20th century's entanglement of myth and power distorted these truths, but it did not erase them. As tools improved and perspectives widened, the deeper past re-emerged with greater clarity. What once seemed fantastical became contextual. What once seemed impossible became plausible within a broader framework of human response to change. This ongoing reassessment does not diminish skepticism. It sharpens it. By grounding interpretation in measurable data while acknowledging the limits of preservation, modern research navigates between denial and fantasy. In doing so, it restores legitimacy to the question of deep antiquity without surrendering rigor. The past revealed through this lens is neither a lost golden age nor a blank slate. It is a layered record of survival under pressure, marked by innovation, constrained by circumstance. Understanding it requires patience, restraint, and a willingness to accept that much remains hidden, not because it never existed, but because time and transformation reshaped how it can be seen. As investigative tools evolved, the scale of early human modification of landscapes became clearer, not through speculation, but through measurement. Technologies designed for mapping terrain began revealing patterns invisible from the ground. Dense forests that once concealed human presence yielded to precise scans, stripping vegetation from the equation and exposing what lay beneath. What emerged was not random disturbance, but deliberate planning expressed across wide areas. In regions once assumed to be pristine wilderness, rectilinear forms appeared beneath centuries of growth. Elevated platforms, causeways, and geometric enclosures traced networks that extended for kilometers. These were not isolated features. They formed integrated systems linking settlements, agricultural zones, and ceremonial spaces. The implication was unavoidable. Large populations had organized themselves at scales previously considered impossible for societies without writing or metal tools. The significance of these findings lies not only in their extent, but in their chronology. Many of the revealed landscapes predate classical civilizations by thousands of years. Their builders reshaped terrain through coordinated labor, managing water flow and soil fertility in environments that demanded adaptation rather than domination. Raised fields mitigated flooding. Canals redistributed seasonal rainfall. Roads connected communities across challenging terrain. These solutions reflect accumulated environmental knowledge rather than improvisation. Such discoveries reframed earlier assumptions about technological thresholds. Complexity did not require iron or wheels. It required planning, cooperation, and continuity. Stone tools, wooden implements, and human organization proved sufficient when guided by shared purpose. The absence of metal artifacts in these regions had long been mistaken for absence of sophistication. What changed was not the past, but the lens through which it was examined. Remote sensing also revealed that many ancient settlements were deliberately ephemeral in appearance. Structures built from earth and wood blended back into the landscape once abandoned. Over time, only their outlines remained, visible only when viewed at scale. This explains why conventional excavation overlooked them for so long. Archaeology favored durable materials, inadvertently privileging stone-heavy cultures while underrepresenting those that built differently. In floodplains and tropical zones, this bias is especially pronounced. Organic materials decay rapidly, and seasonal inundation reshapes surfaces continuously. Societies adapted by building with the landscape rather than against it. Their architecture emphasized integration and renewal over permanence. When these societies declined or relocated, their traces softened rather than shattered, leaving subtle signatures instead of monumental ruins. Satellite imagery extended this revelation into deserts and high-altitude regions. Beneath dunes and ice, anomalies suggested buried structures aligned with known settlement patterns. In some cases, ancient riverbeds could be traced beneath arid terrain, revealing corridors of habitation that vanished when climate shifted. These ghost rivers explained the presence of sites now stranded far from water sources. They also clarified migration routes that once followed flowing systems now erased from the surface. Ground-penetrating radar added another layer of insight. Without disturbing soil, it detected subsurface features indicating walls, foundations, and cavities. Entire layouts could be mapped before excavation began, preserving context while minimizing intrusion. This approach transformed how sites were interpreted, emphasizing pattern over artifact. It allowed researchers to see organization where isolated finds once seemed inconclusive. The accumulation of these methods produced a convergence of evidence. Early societies were more widespread, more organized, and more environmentally responsive than previously acknowledged. Their disappearance from view corresponded closely with climatic upheavals documented in ice cores and sediment records. Rising seas, shifting rainfall, and temperature swings reconfigured habitable zones rapidly. Societies positioned at ecological margins faced choices between relocation, adaptation, or collapse. What followed was not uniform. Some groups dispersed into smaller units. Others concentrated in stable refuges such as river valleys or highlands. Still others engineered solutions that allowed continued occupation despite volatility. Each response left a different archaeological signature. Together, they explain the uneven distribution of early complexity across regions and time periods. Importantly, these findings shifted emphasis away from singular lost civilizations toward distributed networks of human ingenuity. Instead of searching for one vanished empire, attention turned to understanding how many communities independently developed sophisticated strategies suited to their environments. Shared challenges produced parallel solutions. Knowledge traveled along waterways and migration routes, fragmenting and recombining as circumstances demanded. This perspective also clarified the relationship between myth and material culture. Stories of cities swallowed by earth or water align with real processes that erased entire landscapes. Legends of hidden paths and forgotten roads mirror networks now visible only through scanning. What had been dismissed as exaggeration began to resemble compressed memory, reshaped by transmission, but grounded in experience. The discipline responded by integrating environmental science more deeply into historical analysis. Climate models informed settlement studies. Geological timelines contextualized cultural shifts. Archaeology expanded beyond excavation to include mapping, simulation, and cross-disciplinary synthesis. Each field reinforced the others, reducing reliance on speculation while expanding explanatory power. This integration revealed another crucial point. The pace of change matters as much as magnitude. Gradual environmental shifts allow adaptation through incremental adjustment. Abrupt changes overwhelm systems built on stability. The end of the last ice age delivered rapid transitions that tested social resilience. Communities that had thrived for generations found their strategies obsolete within lifetimes. The archaeological record bears witness to this compression of adaptation time. Recognizing this dynamic reframes the narrative of progress. Civilization did not advance steadily from simplicity to complexity. It surged, stalled, fragmented, and reassembled in response to forces beyond human control. Technological capability waxed and waned alongside environmental opportunity. What survived did so not because it was superior, but because it was positioned favorably when conditions shifted. Modern tools made this pattern visible by restoring lost context. They did not invent complexity where none existed. They revealed it where preservation had failed. In doing so, they corrected a distortion introduced by selective survival. History written from what remains above ground inevitably underestimates what once stood elsewhere. As these insights accumulated, the boundaries of early history expanded outward. The timeline of organized human activity stretched deeper. The geographic range widened. Diversity of adaptation replaced singular origin stories. The past grew more intricate, not less. This complexity does not undermine established knowledge. It refines it. By acknowledging the role of environmental transformation and preservation bias, interpretation becomes more accurate. The absence of writing no longer equates to absence of planning. The lack of monuments no longer implies lack of structure. What emerges is a portrait of early humanity shaped by negotiation with a volatile planet. Tools changed, but principles endured. Cooperation, memory, and adaptability formed the core of survival. Modern technology, by uncovering the faint outlines of these principles etched into land and stone, allows a more balanced reconstruction of that story. In the spaces revealed between forest and floodplain, beneath desert and ice, the record speaks quietly but consistently. Human societies were capable long before history learned to keep score. Their achievements were shaped, hidden, and sometimes erased by forces indifferent to memory. What remains is enough to recognize continuity across loss and to understand that the deep past was neither empty nor simple, but densely inhabited by effort, intelligence, and resilience. As evidence accumulated across continents, a clearer pattern emerged, one that did not rely on speculation, but on alignment between disciplines. Geological timelines mapped periods of instability with increasing precision. Archaeological discoveries filled gaps left by erosion and inundation. Anthropology traced how memory persists through ritual and structure rather than text. Together, these threads wove a narrative in which early human history appeared less linear and far more contingent on environmental thresholds. The transition out of the Ice Age marked one such threshold. It reshaped coastlines, altered ecosystems, and forced populations to renegotiate their relationship with land. What survived this transition did so unevenly. Communities situated in resilient zones, such as stable river valleys or elevated plateaus, consolidated. Those positioned along vulnerable coasts were displaced or erased. This uneven survival shaped later perceptions of origin, concentrating visible complexity in places of refuge rather than in places of innovation. The archaeological record reflects this distortion. Regions that remained habitable preserved continuity, allowing skills and traditions to accumulate visibly. Regions overtaken by water or sediment lost continuity despite having hosted dense populations. When later societies emerged, they did so atop remnants rather than foundations. Knowledge appeared sudden because its earlier expressions were gone. Innovation seemed abrupt because its precursors lay beyond reach. This dynamic reframes how early monuments are interpreted. Instead of viewing them as spontaneous leaps, they can be understood as reassertions of inherited capability under new conditions. Builders did not start from nothing. They worked from memory, from techniques refined elsewhere and carried inward by migration. Stone architecture, astronomical orientation, and social coordination reflect consolidation rather than invention. The same applies to symbolic systems. Mythology did not arise merely to explain the unknown. It functioned as a vessel for compressed experience. Flood narratives encoded collective trauma. Cycles of destruction and renewal mirrored climatic oscillations. Sacred geography preserved spatial memory of lost centers. These stories endured because they provided continuity when physical anchors vanished. Modern skepticism often demands direct proof, yet direct proof is rare precisely where disruption was greatest. The absence of cities beneath the sea does not indicate absence of settlement, but the difficulty of recovery. Where underwater archaeology has advanced, it consistently confirms that coastlines once supported human life at scales previously underestimated. Each submerged site extends the map of habitation outward, correcting inland bias. The cumulative effect of these corrections is subtle but profound. Early humanity appears less primitive and more adaptive. Complexity manifests not as a single origin point, but as repeated responses to constraint. Organization emerges where cooperation is required. Monumentality appears where permanence is threatened. Concealment develops where exposure proves fatal. These patterns recur across cultures without requiring direct contact. This understanding also resolves apparent contradictions. Advanced construction without agriculture becomes plausible when viewed as ritual consolidation rather than surplus-driven expansion. Long-distance alignment without writing becomes intelligible when knowledge is transmitted through practice and observation. Precision without metal tools reflects patience and repetition rather than technological deficiency. What disappears from this picture is the need for extraordinary explanations. No lost supercivilization is required to account for early complexity, nor is human ingenuity minimized. The record points instead to societies operating at the limits imposed by environment, using available means to preserve coherence. Their achievements were remarkable, not because they defied nature, but because they negotiated with it. The role of catastrophe remains central. Environmental change acts as a filter, determining what persists and what dissolves. This filter does not select for importance, only for durability. Stone endures where wood decays. Elevated ground survives where plains drown. The historical narrative built from these survivors reflects the filter's bias, rather than a complete account. Recognizing this bias alters how future discoveries are approached. Instead of asking where civilization began, inquiry shifts toward how it endured. Instead of seeking singular origins, attention turns to networks of adaptation. Instead of dismissing anomalies, they are examined as signals of missing context. Each anomaly suggests not an error, but an absence waiting to be addressed. This shift carries methodological consequences. Collaboration across fields becomes essential. Climate data contextualizes settlement. Remote sensing guides excavation. Ethnography informs interpretation of symbolic continuity. Together, these approaches reduce reliance on conjecture while expanding explanatory range. The past becomes more accessible as context is restored, even when artifacts remain sparse. The implications extend beyond academic debate. Understanding how early societies responded to rapid environmental change offers perspective on resilience and vulnerability. Past populations faced disruptions that redefined habitability. Their responses varied, but common strategies emerged: relocation, consolidation, concealment, and ritualization. These strategies preserved social cohesion when material conditions failed. Such insights do not romanticize the past. They acknowledge loss as a defining force. Entire worlds disappeared, taking with them languages, practices, and identities. Survival was selective and often brutal. Yet continuity persisted through adaptation rather than dominance. Knowledge survived not because it was powerful, but because it was flexible. In the end, early human history appears neither as a straight ascent nor as a forgotten golden age. It appears as a mosaic shaped by thresholds. Each threshold forced choices. Some choices left visible traces. Others vanished beneath water or soil. What remains is partial, but not meaningless. It outlines a capacity for organization that predates writing and metallurgy, rooted in cooperation and memory. The task of reconstruction is ongoing. Each new method reveals more of what was hidden. Each discovery recalibrates timelines without erasing what is known. The story grows denser, not simpler. Certainty gives way to probability, and probability to pattern. Within these patterns lies a consistent message. Humanity's deep past was complex, adaptive, and profoundly shaped by forces beyond its control. By tracing how societies responded to instability, a more coherent narrative takes form. It does not rely on legends as literal truth, nor does it dismiss them as fantasy. It situates them as cultural residues of real conditions. In doing so, it restores balance to the historical record, acknowledging both what endured and what was lost. What emerges is a history defined less by beginnings than by survival. The roots of civilization lie not in a single place or time, but in repeated acts of reorganization after collapse. These acts left uneven traces, yet together they chart a continuous human effort to impose order on a shifting world. That effort, preserved imperfectly across land and sea, forms the true backbone of early history. As the environmental chaos of the early Holocene settled into a new equilibrium, human societies began to stabilize within the boundaries left to them. The coastlines that remained became fixed points rather than shifting margins. River systems established predictable rhythms. In these conditions, memory that had once been preserved through movement and concealment could now be externalized. Symbols hardened into structures, rituals crystallized into institutions. What had survived as fragments began to assemble into recognizable cultural forms. This period did not mark a sudden awakening, but a phase of consolidation. Groups that had carried knowledge through disruption now applied it to rebuilding durable systems. Agricultural practices expanded not as a singular invention, but as refinements of earlier experimentation. Seed selection, seasonal timing, and land management reflected long familiarity rather than abrupt discovery. Domestication emerged unevenly across regions, guided by local ecology and inherited understanding. Settlements grew denser around reliable resources. Architecture shifted from temporary shelters to permanent dwellings. Yet even as permanence increased, traces of earlier caution remained. Elevated platforms protected against flooding. Storage facilities anticipated scarcity. Defensive layouts reflected lingering awareness of instability. These features suggest that the memory of loss did not vanish when conditions improved. It informed design choices long after immediate danger receded. Writing appeared within this context of consolidation. Its emergence coincided with the need to manage surplus, coordinate labor, and formalize authority. Early scripts recorded transactions, offerings, and inventories. They did not capture origin stories or ancient catastrophes. Those memories persisted elsewhere, embedded in ceremony, myth, and monumental orientation. Writing served administration rather than remembrance, explaining why the deepest past remained undocumented even as societies became literate. Monuments erected during this phase often referenced an earlier age. Orientation toward celestial events connected present order to cosmic cycles older than any dynasty. Sacred precincts were positioned atop sites already marked by significance. Builders aligned their work with horizons and stars, whose patterns had guided communities through migration and loss. In this way, architecture became a bridge between eras, anchoring the present within a remembered continuity. The spread of similar architectural motifs across distant regions reflects shared responses rather than direct transmission. Stepped platforms, circular enclosures, and axial alignments appear independently where communities faced comparable constraints. These forms balanced stability and symbolism, expressing control over space while acknowledging forces beyond it. Their recurrence speaks to convergent adaptation rather than centralized origin. As populations expanded, social stratification increased. Leadership roles formalized. Surplus enabled specialization. Craft traditions matured. Yet beneath these developments lay practices honed under far harsher conditions. Cooperation, scheduling, and shared labor had been essential for survival long before they supported hierarchy. The capacity to organize large groups did not arise with abundance, it preceded it. This continuity complicates narratives that place civilization's beginning at a clear threshold. What appears as a start is often a visibility event, the moment when conditions allowed durable expression. Earlier phases were no less complex, but their traces were vulnerable. Once stability returned, those traces multiplied, reinforcing the illusion of sudden emergence. Cultural memory adjusted accordingly. Stories once grounded in lived catastrophe shifted toward symbolic instruction. Floods became moral lessons. Lost lands transformed into metaphors of decline. Hidden refuges evolved into spiritual ideals. This transformation did not erase original meaning, but layered it with abstraction. The further societies moved from disruption, the more their narratives emphasized order over survival. Archaeological sequences reflect this shift. Layers show increasing regularity in construction and artifact distribution. Variation narrows as standards emerge. Measurement systems unify. Artistic motifs repeat with refinement. These patterns indicate institutionalization rather than innovation. The creative leap had occurred earlier, under pressure. What followed was replication. In this light, the debate over early civilization reframes itself. The question is not when humanity became capable of complexity, but when complexity became durable. Durability depends on environment as much as ingenuity. When land stopped disappearing beneath water and climate stabilized, human effort could accumulate rather than reset. History became recordable because it became continuous. This perspective also clarifies why some regions appear central while others fade. Centers formed where stability persisted. Margins dissolved where instability returned. Over time, centers accumulated narrative authority, defining history from their vantage point. Margins contributed innovations, but lost visibility when conditions shifted. The resulting record privileges survivors, not pioneers. The consolidation phase thus represents both preservation and loss. It preserved knowledge by embedding it in enduring forms. It lost nuance by smoothing over fragmentation. The deeper past survived indirectly, refracted through later expression. What we inherit is a stabilized version of a more volatile story. Recognizing this helps reconcile anomalies. Early feats that seem improbable fit within a longer arc of capability. Myths that seem exaggerated align with lived extremes. Gaps in evidence reflect environmental filtering rather than absence of activity. Each inconsistency becomes a clue rather than a contradiction. The formation of early civilizations was therefore less a birth than a reassembly. Pieces scattered by catastrophe were gathered, aligned, and fixed in place. Writing captured administration. Stone captured memory. Ritual captured meaning. Together they formed a resilient framework capable of withstanding future disruption. This framework carried humanity forward into recorded history. It allowed societies to expand, trade, and compete at scales unimaginable during the Ice Age. Yet its foundations were laid earlier, under conditions that demanded adaptability rather than accumulation. Those foundations shaped how later civilizations understood themselves, even when their origins faded from conscious awareness. The story of early consolidation is one of patience rewarded. Survival strategies evolved into institutions. Temporary solutions became permanent features. What had once been emergency measures hardened into tradition. In this transformation lies the quiet transition from prehistory to history, not as a moment of invention, but as a gradual stabilization of a world that had finally stopped slipping away. Through this lens, the deep past does not stand apart from civilization. It flows into it. The lessons learned under pressure continued to inform design, belief, and governance. Civilization did not emerge in spite of catastrophe, but through the long process of adapting to its aftermath. That process, uneven and incomplete, remains etched into the structures and stories that mark humanity's earliest recorded steps. As early civilizations stabilized, the ways they understood time itself began to change. Survival had once required attention to immediate cycles of weather, migration, and scarcity. Now, with relative environmental predictability, time could be extended outward. Seasons became calendars. Memory became lineage. The past was no longer only something endured, but something interpreted, organized, and placed into frameworks that explained why the present existed as it did. This reorientation altered how societies related to their deepest memories. Events that had once been experienced directly were now several generations removed. Their emotional intensity softened, while their symbolic value increased. Catastrophe transformed into cosmology. What had been a lived collapse of land and order became a story of cycles, ages, and renewals. These narratives did not aim for precision. They aimed for meaning, preserving lessons rather than details. Across cultures, time was divided into great periods marked by transformation. Ages ended in destruction and began in renewal. Floods, fires, and darkness separated one era from the next. Such structures mirrored environmental history without recording it explicitly. Rapid climatic shifts left imprints on collective consciousness that outlasted direct memory. When societies later formalized these impressions, they encoded them into myths that explained why the world required balance, restraint, and ritual maintenance. Calendrical systems emerged from this need to synchronize human activity with natural cycles. Observations of the sun, moon, and stars allowed communities to anticipate seasonal change and coordinate labor. These systems did more than regulate agriculture. They anchored society within a larger order, connecting human time to cosmic rhythm. The sky became a reference point precisely because the ground had once proven unreliable. Monuments aligned with celestial events served as temporal anchors. They marked solstices, equinoxes, and stellar risings that structured ritual life. Such alignments required long-term observation and intergenerational transmission of knowledge. They demonstrate continuity of attention across centuries. This continuity suggests that memory survived disruption not only as narrative, but as practice, embodied in repeated observation rather than written explanation. The emphasis on cycles also shaped political authority. Rulers positioned themselves as mediators between human society and cosmic order. Their legitimacy depended on maintaining balance, ensuring that rituals were performed correctly and at the proper time. Failure to do so risked disorder, framed not merely as social unrest, but as cosmic imbalance. In this way, governance inherited responsibilities shaped by earlier experiences of fragility. Law codes and moral systems reflected similar concerns. Excess, hubris, and neglect of duty were portrayed as triggers for collapse. These themes echo inherited memory of societies undone by forces beyond control. Moral restraint became a safeguard against repeating disaster. Even when framed philosophically or theologically, these ideas carried practical origins rooted in survival. As trade networks expanded, cultural exchange spread these temporal frameworks. Calendars, rituals, and myths traveled alongside goods. They adapted to local conditions while retaining core structures. This diffusion created overlapping systems of meaning that reinforced each other across regions. Shared symbols emerged not because of centralized origin, but because similar experiences had shaped similar responses. Writing, once established, began to record these systems selectively. Genealogies traced authority backward. Chronicles linked present rulers to heroic or divine ancestors. These texts compressed vast spans of time into ordered sequences, smoothing irregularities. What could not be reconciled with stability was relegated to mythic prehistory, set apart from documented history. This division created the illusion of a clear boundary where none had existed. The act of recording itself altered memory. Written accounts privileged continuity and legitimacy. Disruption became something that happened to others, or in distant ages. The immediacy of catastrophe faded, replaced by confidence in order. Yet material culture preserved reminders. Buried structures, anomalous alignments, and reused foundations hinted at deeper layers beneath official narratives. Ritual practices often retained closer ties to older memory than text. Seasonal festivals reenacted renewal. Initiation rites symbolized passage through chaos into order. Sacrificial symbolism echoed themes of loss and restoration. These practices persisted even when their origins were no longer consciously understood. They functioned as embodied memory, reinforcing cohesion through repetition. The relationship between humans and landscape also shifted. Where earlier societies adapted constantly to change, later ones reshaped environments to enforce stability. Irrigation systems controlled water flow. Terracing stabilized slopes. Urban planning imposed geometry on space. These interventions reflect confidence born of relative predictability, yet they were guided by lessons learned when predictability failed. This tension between control and remembrance defined the mature phase of early civilization. Societies sought permanence, yet carried awareness of impermanence. They built to last, yet encoded warnings within their myths and monuments. The past was not forgotten. It was reframed to support present order. Over time, the reframing became so effective that its origins blurred. Later observers encountered coherent systems without seeing the pressures that shaped them. Stability appeared natural rather than achieved. Complexity seemed inevitable rather than contingent. Only when anomalies surfaced did cracks appear in the narrative. These anomalies invite re-evaluation, not of capability, but of context. Early civilizations did not emerge in a vacuum. They assembled from fragments carried through disruption. Their understanding of time, order, and responsibility reflects that inheritance. When time is seen as cyclical rather than linear, it reveals a worldview shaped by repetition of loss and renewal. The endurance of this worldview across millennia suggests its effectiveness. It allowed societies to integrate memory without being paralyzed by it. Catastrophe became instruction rather than prophecy. The future was shaped not by fear of collapse, but by rituals designed to prevent it. In this sense, the deep past continued to govern the present long after its events faded from direct awareness. The architecture of time itself, as conceived by early civilizations, bears the imprint of adaptation under pressure. Calendars, myths, and monuments stand as responses to instability transformed into structure. Understanding this transformation clarifies how civilization maintained coherence after upheaval. It did not erase the past, it reorganized it. Memory was layered, filtered, and embedded in systems that prioritized continuity. Through this process, humanity learned not only how to survive catastrophe, but how to remember it without reliving it. The legacy of that learning persists. It shapes how history is told, how time is divided, and how societies imagine their place within larger cycles. Beneath the surface of recorded chronology lies a deeper rhythm, one established when the world itself was changing too fast to trust. That rhythm continues to pulse quietly through the foundations of civilization, a reminder that order was earned, not given. As societies carried forward the stabilized frameworks of time, ritual, and authority, another transformation unfolded quietly beneath the surface of daily life. Knowledge that had once been shared broadly within small groups began to fragment into specialized domains. Skills passed through lineages. Techniques became guarded. Understanding was no longer communal by necessity, but selective by design. This shift marked a new phase in human organization, one shaped less by survival under pressure and more by control over continuity. Specialization allowed complexity to deepen. Craft traditions refined materials with increasing precision. Stonecutters mastered geometry. Builders standardized proportions. Astronomer priests tracked celestial cycles with accuracy refined through generations of observation. Farmers developed localized expertise in soil, seed, and water. Each domain advanced not through sudden insight, but through cumulative refinement anchored in memory and repetition. This accumulation created asymmetry within societies. Those who held specialized knowledge gained influence, not because they ruled overtly, but because stability depended on their expertise. Ritual calendars required correct timing. Irrigation demanded maintenance. Architecture relied on inherited measurement systems. Error threatened order. As a result, trust in specialists became institutionalized, embedding knowledge within roles rather than individuals. The physical environment reinforced this shift. As landscapes were reshaped through human intervention, maintenance became essential. Canals required clearing. Terraces needed repair. Storage facilities demanded protection. These systems rewarded continuity and punished disruption. Societies that preserved technical memory thrived. Those that lost it regressed quickly. Knowledge became infrastructure invisible yet indispensable. This invisibility shaped how later history interpreted the past. Written records emphasized rulers, conflicts, and decrees, but rarely documented the technical foundations that sustained daily life. When systems functioned, they went unnoticed. When they failed, collapse followed swiftly. Archaeology captures moments of failure more readily than moments of balance, skewing perception toward decline rather than endurance. Yet endurance left traces in design consistency. Standardized units of measure appear across long spans, suggesting stable transmission of abstract concepts. Architectural layouts repeat with variation, indicating adherence to inherited principles rather than improvisation. Artistic motifs persist with controlled evolution, reflecting continuity within constraint. These patterns reveal disciplined memory operating beneath surface change. The compartmentalization of knowledge also altered how memory of catastrophe was handled. Instead of circulating as collective narrative, it became embedded in practice. Building codes reflected flood awareness. Settlement placement avoided unstable ground. Ritual prohibitions encoded environmental caution. The memory of disaster no longer needed to be told explicitly. It was enacted through habit. Over generations, the origins of these habits faded. What remained was tradition justified by authority rather than explanation. Instructions persisted without context. Techniques were followed because they worked, not because their origins were remembered. This process protected knowledge from distortion, but detached it from its historical roots. When disruptions occurred later, societies sometimes lost the reasoning behind their systems while retaining the forms. Monuments were copied without understanding alignment. Rituals continued without awareness of their original function. Infrastructure degraded when maintenance knowledge fragmented. These losses illustrate how fragile continuity becomes once specialization outpaces shared comprehension. Despite this fragility, specialization allowed societies to expand beyond what generalized knowledge could support. Cities grew, trade intensified, cultural exchange accelerated. Techniques spread unevenly, adapting to local conditions. Some knowledge traveled intact. Other elements transformed beyond recognition. The result was diversity built upon common foundations laid during earlier adaptation. This diversity complicates attempts to trace single origins. Similar techniques appear in distant regions, not because of centralized diffusion, but because comparable constraints shaped comparable solutions. Knowledge refined under pressure proved transferable when conditions aligned. Migration, trade, and imitation facilitated spread, but adaptation remained local. The process also generated feedback loops. As societies grew more complex, they became more vulnerable to systemic failure. Specialized knowledge created efficiency but reduced redundancy. When key roles were disrupted, recovery slowed. This vulnerability echoed earlier experiences of collapse, reinforcing the need for institutional safeguards. Institutions emerged to address this risk. Apprenticeship formalized transmission. Guild-like structures protected techniques. Religious orders preserved astronomical and calendrical knowledge. Archives stored records that could outlast individuals. These mechanisms stabilized memory across generations, extending continuity beyond immediate social bonds. However, institutional memory introduced rigidity. Systems optimized for stability resisted change even when conditions shifted. What had once been adaptive became conservative. Innovation slowed. When environmental or social pressures returned, inflexibility increased risk. This tension between preservation and adaptation recurs throughout history. Archaeological layers reflect these cycles. Periods of expansion show standardization and refinement. Periods of contraction reveal fragmentation and loss. Techniques disappear, reappear, or mutate. Each cycle leaves a partial imprint, contributing to the illusion of abrupt beginnings and endings. Understanding this dynamic reframes early civilization as a process rather than a state. Complexity accumulated unevenly, distributed across domains and regions. Knowledge survived not as a monolith, but as interlocking practices vulnerable to disruption, yet resilient through redundancy. The past appears discontinuous because its transmission was selective. This selectivity explains why some ancient achievements seem isolated. They were peaks supported by broad but fragile bases. When those bases eroded, the peaks stood alone, puzzling later observers. Without context, they appeared anomalous. With context restored, they align with broader patterns of adaptation. The legacy of early specialization persists in modern assumptions about progress. History often celebrates visible innovation while overlooking the invisible labor of maintenance. Yet it is maintenance that preserves knowledge across instability. Early societies understood this implicitly, embedding memory into roles, rituals, and routines. By examining how specialization shaped continuity, a deeper coherence emerges. Civilization did not advance simply by discovering new ideas. It advanced by protecting hard-won knowledge against loss. This protection required structure, discipline, and acceptance of constraint. It also required remembering, in practice if not in story, that stability was conditional. The world that followed the Ice Age offered opportunity, but not certainty. Societies that thrived learned to balance expansion with preservation. They built systems capable of surviving not just success, but disruption. Their achievements were cumulative responses to earlier fragility, refined through generations that understood, even if unconsciously, what was at stake. Seen from this perspective, early civilization becomes an extended act of remembrance. Not a remembrance expressed in words, but in the careful transmission of skills that kept order intact. Beneath the surface of monuments and myths lies a quieter legacy, one forged by those who carried knowledge forward without knowing if it would be needed again. That legacy, fragmented yet persistent, underpins everything that followed. As civilizations expanded and specialized knowledge became embedded within institutions, the distance between lived experience and inherited memory continued to grow. What earlier generations had adapted to directly was now encountered only through ritual, architecture, and tradition. The practical reasons behind certain choices faded, leaving forms that persisted because they worked, not because they were understood. Over time, this separation altered how societies interpreted both their past and their place within it. Monumental centers became focal points of identity. Cities were no longer simply places of habitation, but symbols of order imposed upon landscape. Walls defined boundaries, grids structured movement, sacred precincts marked separation between the ordinary and the transcendent. These spatial arrangements were not arbitrary. They reflected deep assumptions about stability, hierarchy, and permanence forged during earlier periods of uncertainty. Yet as generations passed, the connection between design and survival blurred. Urban growth introduced new vulnerabilities. Concentrated populations depended on uninterrupted systems of supply, maintenance, and governance. When these systems functioned, cities flourished. When they faltered, collapse was rapid. Archaeological layers reveal cycles of construction and abandonment, often repeating in the same locations. This repetition reflects both the attractiveness of certain sites and the persistence of inherited spatial memory. Even after destruction, people returned to rebuild where meaning already resided. Trade networks intensified these dynamics. Goods, ideas, and techniques moved across vast distances, knitting regions together. Shared standards of weight, measure, and value facilitated exchange. Yet integration increased exposure to disruption. A failure in one region reverberated through others. The interdependence that supported growth also amplified risk, echoing earlier patterns where environmental change cascaded across connected systems. Cultural narratives adapted accordingly. Stories emphasized moral causation over environmental explanation. Decline was attributed to corruption, impiety, or loss of virtue. Such interpretations preserved social cohesion by framing collapse as avoidable through correct behavior. They also obscured the role of external forces beyond human control. Memory of climate instability receded, replaced by ethical frameworks that internalized responsibility. This moralization of history shaped governance. Rulers presented themselves as guarantors of balance, tasked with maintaining order through correct ritual and law. Their legitimacy rested on continuity, linking present authority to an idealized past. Even when conditions shifted, the language of restoration persisted. New regimes claimed to revive ancient order rather than create something new. Change was justified as recovery. Material culture reinforces this pattern. New constructions often imitated older styles, even when materials or techniques differed. This imitation signaled connection rather than innovation. By anchoring the present to the past, societies reinforced legitimacy and stability. The cost was reduced flexibility. When old solutions no longer matched new conditions, adaptation slowed. Periods of stress exposed this tension. Droughts, resource depletion, and external pressure-tested systems optimized for stability. In some cases, societies adapted by decentralizing or restructuring. In others, rigidity led to fragmentation. The archaeological record captures both outcomes, showing divergence rather than uniform collapse. Responses varied based on how memory, authority, and environment interacted. In regions where memory remained embedded in practice rather than hierarchy, adaptation tended to be more fluid. Smaller communities adjusted settlement patterns, diversified subsistence, and altered social organization. Their traces are subtle and often overlooked, yet they represent resilience through flexibility. Larger, centralized systems, while powerful, faced greater inertia. The contrast highlights a fundamental trade-off. Complexity enables coordination and scale, but it reduces tolerance for disruption. Early experiences of catastrophe had favored adaptability. Later success favored control. Over time, the balance shifted toward preservation of order at the expense of responsiveness. This shift did not eliminate the capacity for adaptation, but it constrained it within established frameworks. Mythology evolved in parallel. Stories that once encoded survival strategies became allegories of moral order. Floods transformed into judgments. Lost lands became warnings. Hidden refuges became spiritual ideals. These transformations preserved emotional truth while distancing narratives from their environmental origins. The past was remembered, but in a form that supported present stability. The layering of memory created depth, but also distortion. Each generation inherited interpretations shaped by earlier needs. Original contexts became inaccessible, buried beneath reinterpretation. When later scholars encountered anomalies, they often treated them as isolated curiosities rather than fragments of a larger adaptive history. This layering explains why certain ancient features appear excessive or enigmatic. Foundations seem oversized. Alignments appear unnecessarily precise. These features made sense within a framework shaped by loss and uncertainty, where durability and cosmic anchoring were priorities. Removed from that framework, they appear puzzling. Understanding this process reframes decline not as failure, but as transformation under constraint. Societies did not forget their past, they repurposed it. Memory shifted from instruction to justification. Practices continued because they symbolized continuity, even when their original function diminished. This continuity sustained identity through change, but it also obscured causation. Over long spans, cycles of consolidation and fragmentation repeated. Each cycle left residues that informed the next. Techniques rediscovered, sites reused, stories retold. The deep past exerted influence without direct representation. Its presence was felt through absence, shaping choices by what was no longer visible. When environmental pressures returned, societies sometimes rediscovered older strategies. Settlement patterns adjusted, storage expanded, mobility increased. These responses did not arise spontaneously. They drew upon residual knowledge preserved at the margins. The persistence of such knowledge demonstrates that memory was never fully centralized. It survived in habits, tools, and local practice even when institutions failed. The interplay between center and margin thus becomes central to understanding continuity. Centers preserved order. Margins preserved adaptability. Both were necessary. When balanced, societies endured. When imbalanced, collapse accelerated. This dynamic echoes earlier phases of human history, where survival depended on navigating instability rather than eliminating it. By tracing how memory was transformed into structure and structure into tradition, a more nuanced picture emerges. Civilization did not simply advance away from its origins. It carried those origins forward in altered form. The lessons of a volatile world were not forgotten. They were reframed to support stability in a calmer one. This reframing succeeded for long periods, allowing expansion and refinement. Yet it always carried the risk of misalignment when conditions changed again. The archaeological record preserves these moments of tension, where inherited forms met new realities. They are visible in abandoned cities, modified rituals, and sudden shifts in settlement. The story of early civilization is therefore not a march toward permanence, but a negotiation with impermanence. Stability was achieved, but never guaranteed. Memory was preserved, but never intact. Each generation balanced what it inherited against what it faced. In that balance lies the true continuity of human history, one shaped not by unbroken progress, but by repeated efforts to make meaning endure in a world that had once proven capable of erasing everything. As the long arc of early civilization unfolded, the relationship between memory and landscape continued to evolve. What had once been shaped primarily by survival gradually became shaped by interpretation. Land was no longer only a source of sustenance or threat, but a canvas onto which meaning was projected. Mountains, rivers, and ruins accumulated symbolic weight, transforming geography into narrative. In this process, the physical world became inseparable from cultural identity. Sacred landscapes illustrate this shift clearly. Natural features that had once offered refuge or stability were reimagined as places of origin, revelation, or divine presence. Mountains that provided isolation during periods of disruption became homes of gods or ancestors. Springs and rivers that sustained life after upheaval became symbols of renewal and purity. These reinterpretations did not erase practical origins. They layered significance atop them, ensuring that places central to survival remained central to belief. Ruins played a similar role. Structures inherited from earlier periods were not always understood, but they were rarely ignored. Their endurance invited reverence. Later societies incorporated them into new architectural programs, aligning fresh construction with ancient foundations. This reuse anchored innovation in continuity, allowing change while affirming connection to a deeper past. Even when original function was forgotten, presence alone conferred authority. This tendency influenced how societies narrated their own beginnings. Origins were situated in places already marked by monumentality or natural prominence. Founding myths tied legitimacy to landscape, presenting current order as an extension of primordial design. Such narratives reduced uncertainty by framing the present as inevitable rather than contingent. They transformed adaptation into destiny. Over time, these stories became increasingly abstract. Environmental pressures receded from memory, replaced by moral or cosmic explanations. Yet the persistence of specific locations within myth hints at deeper roots. Flood stories cluster around river valleys. Lost lands are associated with coasts and plains now submerged. Hidden refuges align with mountains and caves. Geography anchors memory even when interpretation shifts. This anchoring explains why certain regions repeatedly attract attention across eras. They concentrate layers of meaning accumulated through survival, adaptation, and reinterpretation. Each layer draws upon the previous one, reinforcing significance. The result is a palimpsest where practical history, symbolic narrative, and political authority overlap. Trade and migration further amplified this process. As people moved, they carried stories tied to specific landscapes. When transplanted, these stories adapted to new environments, mapping familiar meanings onto unfamiliar terrain. Mountains replaced hills, rivers replaced seas. The narrative structure remained, while geography shifted. This portability allowed memory to persist, even as context changed. Archaeological evidence reflects this layering. Sites show repeated occupation interrupted by abandonment and reuse. Each phase modifies what came before, adding new meanings while preserving traces. Excavation reveals these sequences physically, while myth preserves them conceptually. Together, they demonstrate how humans negotiate continuity through reinterpretation rather than preservation alone. The persistence of certain symbolic forms across cultures supports this view. Circular enclosures, elevated platforms, and axial alignments recur not because of shared origin, but because they express relationships between human order and environmental constraint. Circles suggest enclosure and protection. Elevation implies safety from inundation. Alignment connects ground to sky, stabilizing place within larger cycles. These forms emerge wherever similar pressures shaped experience. As societies matured, their ability to manipulate environment increased. Irrigation redirected water. Terracing reshaped slopes. Urbanization concentrated resources. These interventions reduced immediate vulnerability, but introduced long-term dependencies. Maintenance became essential. When maintenance failed, collapse followed swiftly. The landscape, once negotiated, became something to be managed continuously. This shift altered the tone of cultural memory. Earlier narratives emphasized survival against overwhelming force. Later narratives emphasized stewardship and responsibility. Humans positioned themselves as caretakers of order rather than its beneficiaries. This framing reinforced social discipline and justified authority, yet it also obscured the fragility underlying apparent control. Moments of failure punctured this illusion. Droughts, earthquakes, and social unrest exposed dependence on stable systems. In response, societies often intensified ritual and tradition, seeking to restore balance through familiar means. These reactions echo earlier strategies of consolidation after disruption, demonstrating continuity in behavioral response even as context changed. The long-term effect of these cycles was the gradual distancing of origin from awareness. What began as adaptation to catastrophe became encoded as timeless tradition. The reasons behind practices faded, leaving forms intact. Later observers encountered coherent systems without perceiving the pressures that shaped them. Stability appeared natural rather than earned. This perception influenced historical interpretation. Early achievements were attributed to genius or divine favor rather than cumulative adaptation. Collapse was framed as moral failure rather than environmental stress. Such interpretations reinforced confidence in order while minimizing acknowledgement of vulnerability. Modern analysis restores balance by reintegrating environment into the story. When landscapes are read alongside texts and structures, deeper coherence emerges. The past reveals itself as a dialogue between human intention and natural constraint. Civilization appears not as conquest of environment, but as prolonged negotiation with it. Understanding this negotiation reframes resilience. Resilience did not mean permanence. It meant capacity to reconfigure meaning, practice, and structure in response to change. Societies that endured did so by allowing memory to adapt. They preserved lessons while altering expression. They accepted transformation without severing continuity. This adaptive memory is evident in how myths evolved. Stories shifted emphasis while retaining core motifs. Places remained significant even as interpretations changed. Practices persisted even as justification altered. Through these mechanisms, knowledge survived indirectly, protected by symbolism when direct explanation no longer served. The deep past thus exerted influence not through explicit record, but through accumulated habit. Landscapes shaped belief. Belief shaped behavior. Behavior reshaped landscape. This feedback loop sustained civilization across millennia, even as specific cultures rose and fell. By tracing these interactions, a clearer image of early history emerges. It is neither static nor chaotic, but dynamic within bounds set by environment and memory. Each generation inherited both constraint and possibility. Their choices determined how much of the past could be carried forward. In this continuity lies the true legacy of early civilization. It was not defined solely by monuments or institutions, but by the ability to embed experience into place, story, and practice. Through this embedding, humanity maintained coherence despite loss. The landscapes that surround us today still carry these embedded memories, silent yet formative, shaping how societies understand origin, identity, and endurance long after the events that first gave them meaning. By the time recorded history took its familiar shape, the forces that had once torn worlds apart had receded into background rhythm. Seas found new edges. Climate settled into patterns that, while variable, no longer erased continents within a lifetime. Within this relative calm, humanity built confidence in continuity. Yet beneath that confidence lay an inheritance shaped by instability, one that continued to guide behavior long after its origin faded from awareness. Civilization's visible achievements, cities, writing, law, and monumentality often appear as declarations of permanence. They suggest mastery over time and space, but their underlying logic tells a subtler story. Systems were designed with redundancy. Ritual calendars anticipated disruption. Architectural choices privileged durability over efficiency. These features reflect a deep-seated expectation that stability could not be taken for granted. The past had taught restraint, even when the present encouraged expansion. This expectation shaped how societies remembered themselves. Origins were framed not as accidents, but as recoveries. Founding narratives emphasized restoration of order after chaos. Even when expressed in theological or philosophical language, these themes echoed lived experience transmitted across generations. Memory became selective, preserving lessons rather than events. The specific catastrophes receded, but the imperative to prepare remained. As centuries passed, this inherited caution blended with ambition. Empires rose, extending control across landscapes once feared. Infrastructure expanded. Trade networks spanned regions. Yet each expansion carried echoes of earlier limits. Roads followed ancient paths shaped by terrain and water. Cities clustered where resilience had proven possible. Even conquest respected environmental boundaries, learned through prior failure. The archaeological record confirms this continuity. New layers rest atop old ones, aligned rather than arbitrary. Reuse dominates innovation. Foundations are strengthened rather than replaced. Sacred sites persist through cultural change. These patterns reveal respect for inherited knowledge embedded in place. Where adaptation had once ensured survival, tradition now ensured legitimacy. Over time, the balance shifted. Confidence in systems grew. Distance from catastrophe increased. Memory softened further into symbol. The risk of forgetting rose not because lessons vanished, but because their urgency diminished. Practices continued, but awareness of their purpose faded. What had once been essential became customary. This transformation did not erase vulnerability. It concealed it. When pressures returned, through drought, resource strain, or social upheaval, societies rediscovered limits. Responses often echoed ancient strategies: decentralization, ritual intensification, movement toward refuge. These recurrences demonstrate that adaptive memory remained accessible, even if dormant. The long view reveals civilization as a cumulative response to thresholds. Each threshold reshaped priorities. Survival demanded flexibility. Stability demanded structure. Memory bridged the two, allowing lessons learned under pressure to inform behavior during calm. This bridge was imperfect, filtering experience through culture, but it endured. Understanding this process reframes debates about beginnings. There was no single moment when humanity crossed into civilization. There were many moments when humanity reorganized after loss. Each reorganization added layers to a shared repertoire of responses. What later appeared as origin was often consolidation. The same reframing applies to myths of lost worlds. They need not be read as literal maps or dismissed as fantasy. They function as cultural artifacts shaped by real conditions, encoding disruption in narrative form. Their persistence across cultures reflects shared experience rather than shared invention. Water, earth, and fire recur because they were agents of change humans could not ignore. Modern inquiry benefits from recognizing these functions. When disciplines align geology with archaeology and archaeology with anthropology, patterns emerge that no single field could reveal alone. The deep past becomes legible not through isolated proof, but through convergence. Each line of evidence constrains interpretation, reducing excess while expanding context. This convergence points toward a restrained conclusion. Early human societies were neither primitive nor omnipotent. They were capable within limits defined by environment and technology. Their achievements were significant because they were earned under constraint. Their failures were instructive because they shaped memory. The absence of certain evidence does not negate this picture. It reflects preservation bias and methodological reach. Much of early human life unfolded in places least likely to survive: coasts, floodplains, organic structures. What remains is partial, but not misleading if read with care. Gaps speak as loudly as artifacts when contextualized. By integrating absence into interpretation, history regains balance. It acknowledges loss without filling it with fantasy. It recognizes continuity without assuming dominance. It situates humanity within a dynamic planet rather than above it. Civilization emerges as a negotiation, not a conquest. This perspective carries implications beyond the past. It reminds modern societies that stability is conditional. Systems depend on maintenance. Memory requires renewal. The deep past warns not through prophecy, but through pattern. Adaptation succeeds when flexibility and structure coexist. Failure follows when either is neglected. The final lesson of early history lies not in monuments or myths, but in the process that produced them. Humanity endured by learning to carry knowledge across disruption, embedding it in practice, place, and story. This embedding allowed survival without perfect recall. It allowed progress without forgetting vulnerability. When viewed through this lens, the deep past ceases to be distant. It becomes foundational. Its influence persists in how societies build, remember, and respond to change. The world stabilized, but the memory of instability remained active, shaping decisions long after the waters receded and the ice retreated. Civilization, then, is not a break from prehistory. It is prehistory transformed. It is the visible phase of a longer effort to impose order on uncertainty without denying it. That effort continues, informed by lessons learned when the world itself was less forgiving. The story traced across these parts does not conclude with certainty. It concludes with continuity. Human history extends backward into conditions that resist full recovery, yet it connects forward through adaptation. What was lost shaped what survived. What survived informs what comes next. In acknowledging this, the past becomes neither mystery nor myth alone, but a complex inheritance. Its contours are uneven, its record incomplete, yet its influence is coherent. Beneath the surface of recorded time lies a deeper narrative of resilience, shaped by thresholds crossed and lessons retained. That narrative does not demand belief. It invites recognition of how deeply the early world continues to structure the one we inhabit now.